Welcome back to the Bluffton BibleCast. It's a new season. We've got new music and a whole new reading plan. My name is Joe Lehman, and I'm here with Miranda Craighead and Darren Dreyer to introduce you to this season's content. Miranda, I feel like there may be some new listeners. Could you just remind us what the Bluffton BibleCast is all about?
Yeah, sure thing, Joe. The BibleCast is a short weekly podcast that accompanies the church-wide Bible reading plan. It is meant to give insight and context into the scriptures so that we may better understand and comprehend what we're reading. The podcast is not meant to give life application, but we do hope that through it, the listeners will be challenged to dig deeper into the Word and find applications for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Miranda. I'm looking over the reading plan, and there's some mega deep scriptures lined up for this year. Darren, thanks for making the reading plan for us this year. Looks like you got us going through Old Testament prophets, but the book of Revelation is also in the mix. Tell us, what were some of your thoughts as you sketched out the plan?
Well, mostly I was focused on the book of Revelation and its deep connection with the Old Testament. And one aspect of the book that makes it difficult to understand is its many allusions.
Wait, Darren, did you say illusions or allusions?
I need to enunciate better. But it gives me a chance to explain. An illusion with an I is a magic trick that's meant to deceive our senses. An allusion with an A is a reference to something well-known in literature or culture. An example would be Stephen Curtis Chapman. He has a popular song titled Cinderella. And in this song, he refers to his daughter as Cinderella, and he wants to dance with her before the clock strikes midnight and she'll be gone. So this makes sense to us because our culture knows the story of Cinderella, and the whole clock striking midnight makes sense. Mm-hmm. But if you don't know the allusion, the song makes no sense. And in like manner, my man John makes many allusions to the Old Testament prophets in Revelation. So before we read his book, we need to familiarize ourselves with the prophets so we can better understand the revelation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. I've noticed also that in the reading plan, you've organized the prophets into two groups. Prophets that prophesied before the exile and those who prophesied after or during the exile.
This is super helpful information to know when reading it, too.
Miranda, you're a BibleCast veteran. What are some thoughts you have for the church as they tackle the prophets and Revelation this year?
Mm-hmm. Biblical prophecy can be pretty daunting for devotional reading, but only when we don't know the context of it. This year we hope to help with that. We want to connect the prophecies of God to their time in Israel's history and to the ways that Israel continually broke God's covenant. I think that this will help us understand some of the harsh language of the prophets.
Yeah, man, harsh judgment language is not so nice to read. My favorite verses in the prophets are encouraging stuff like, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future."
Preach it, brother.
Right. It is so easy to focus on little verses like that, but we want to give a complete picture of the situation at the time of the prophet. Everyone knows the verse that you just quoted in Jeremiah 29, but did you know that just 5 verses later we can read this? "I will send the sword, famine, and plague against them, and I will make them like figs that are so bad they cannot be eaten. And I will pursue them with the sword, famine, and plague, and will make them abhorrent to all the kingdoms of the earth, a curse and an object of horror, of scorn, of reproach, among all the nations where I drive them."
Ooh, that stings. Why the dramatic swing?
Yeah, it's easy to see when context is taken into consideration. Here, Jeremiah is writing to the Israelite exiles in Babylon. They were hearing from other prophets that Israel would be restored. In the passage, Jeremiah writes them a letter reminding them that the judgment of God on their people still stands. They will be in exile for 70 years. Anyone who tries to subvert that judgment will experience sword, famine, and plague.
Oh, that makes sense.
And like many of the prophets, Jeremiah's message is not without hope. In his letter, Jeremiah reminds the exiles that God does have good plans for them, but they must accept his judgments and wait for him to glorify himself.
Exactly, Darren. As we read and memorize verses in the Bible, we have to remember that there's a lot of context that we may be unaware of.
Good advice, yeah.
Sometimes when I read prophets in the Bible, I get lost in all the repetitive language, which can then be hard to comprehend what I'm reading. Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
You're not alone in that, Miranda. This year, we're we're going to take some time to study the poetic style and the structure of the prophetic books. If we understand the literary method that the prophets are using, then the message will become much more clear, and we can appreciate the beauty of this part of our Bible.
So can you give us an example of literary structure of the prophets?
Sure. The book of Amos has a fun little structure near the beginning. In his day, Amos had a prophetic message to the northern kingdom of Israel. So what does he do? Instead of giving a message directly to them, he begins to pronounce God's judgment on all of their neighbors. From Tyre to Edom, Ammon, and Moab, Amos starts calling them out on all of the injustice that is happening in their cities. Each judgment poem pretty much sounds the same. Finally, in his 7th poem, Amos speaks a judgment on his own kingdom in Judah. By this time, the northern kingdom would have been feeling pretty good about being left off of Amos's prophetic hit list. But from out of nowhere, Amos speaks an extra 8th judgment poem, which is 5 times longer than all of the ones that came before it, aiming directly at the corrupt northern kingdom of Israel.
So are you saying the first judgment were kind of like painting a bullseye on Israel?
Yeah, that's exactly right. He's kind of drawing a noose. Upon first glance, these chapters might seem a little bit random and repetitive. It might seem like Amos is just a cantankerous old farmer shaking his pitchfork and saying, "Get off of my land!" But the closer we look at the structure of his work, we can see that Amos is actually lining up a punch. He's amplifying his message through repetition and creative structure.
That makes sense, Joe, and gives a really good visual. I'm sure that the people of that time weren't new to the idea of poetic structure, so they understood what was being highlighted. But that's not how we gather information in this day and age, so it's not something we pick up on very easily. Good thoughts.
Yeah, like my favorite verses in the prophets are always the verses that foretell Jesus, like, "Unto us a child is born," or "He was pierced for our transgressions."
This is why we as Christians must study the prophets. Although the message was not written to us, each prophet had his own specific audience. Even John the Revelator was writing to a specific audience in his time. So we can't really apply their words directly to ourselves. However, the God who inspired the prophets is the same God we worship today. These books of poetry and judgment are part of the grand story of redemption. We can own them as a part of our story.
So true, Joe. It was in the dark times of Israel's failure and exile that God revealed his mysterious plan for the coming Messiah and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. I can't wait to read the prophets and highlight all the connections to our Jesus.
Okay, picture this. You're sitting in a classroom, and the professor says, "As you know, Christianity teaches that if you live a good life, you go to heaven." How does that make you feel?
Not so good.
Yeah, initially it would make me roll my eyes, but then it would make me sad that so many people actually believe that. It is a total misrepresentation of Christianity.
Yes, it is. And unfortunately, our culture does the same thing with Revelation. See, the word revelation comes from the Greek word apocalypse. And when we hear apocalypse, we tend to think of the end of the world or zombies.
I'll admit, I definitely think of zombies.
Yeah, but the word actually means unveiling or a revelation. So to experience an apocalypse is to have God lift the veil on the spiritual realm and give us insight. In fact, in Galatians 1:12, Paul says the gospel he taught did not come through human origin, but through apocalypse of Jesus Christ.
So what are the characteristics of apocalyptic literature?
Great question. It's typically a vision that occurred during a time of crisis, such as the Babylonian captivity, and it also uses rich figurative language. It's quite beautiful, but it lends itself to multiple interpretations.
You know, one of my favorite Bible scholars says that biblical prophecy is ambiguous by design. The words were given to give hope to the people who first heard them and to give God glory upon their fulfillment. We can make a mistake, though, when we decide that we think we can use biblical prophecy to predict a detailed future. The words of God will all come to pass, and they will give him glory. Some have already been fulfilled. Some will be fulfilled in our future. And some will maybe be fulfilled in both. That is the poetry of God's plan and work.
Man, it's been a pleasure discussing the future of this year's podcast with you both, Joe and Darren. Listeners, we hope that this trailer episode gave you a good idea of what to expect with this year's podcasts and reading plan as we dive headfirst into the prophets and revelations. We are very excited to start digging into the Word with you this year. Have a blessed week.